So, 2 weeks ago, during our review of Cosmic Rewind, that new coaster over at EPCOT, I mentioned that the coaster, by sheer coincidence, shared an odd history with some animation developed in story meetings during Walt's lifetime, animation that was never actually produced. In 1940, as Walt's visual opus Fantasia was being finished, he explored ways that in future years, he could keep adding to the Fantasia project. Fantasia is a musical film with 7 sections, each one pairing animation with classical music. Walt's idea was that he would continue to develop new sections that could be added into the film when some existing segments were retired. It's one of those sections proposed in 1940 but never actually made that has this odd shared development history with the new coaster. So today we're going to look at Walt's process to develop Fantasia. We're going to talk about segments that were proposed but never created for later versions of Fantasia, and we'll talk about some odd coincidences that link up that project from the 1940s with that new attraction that recently opened at EPCOT. But before we jump into this unusual episode, I need to thank a few more recent Bandcamp subscribers. We're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast, and these are some of the good people who keep this project going. Today, gratitude is going out to Clem71, Mike My Bell, the Olsen Home, Jeff, Lily, Ellen, AP Bruschetta, Megan, and Norty. Thanks to each of you for supporting the show. And now, let's all jump into some craziness. Here we go. We're going to weave through a few things today, but let's jump in here. Back in the latter half of 1940, in the months leading up to the release of Fantasia, Walt met with people in his story department to discuss possible ideas for new segments that could be added into the film in subsequent years. Fantasia is a unique project at the Disney studio because it runs counter to the primary artistic direction of most early features. At some point, in terms of artistic representation, Walt had a binary choice as to how he wanted to develop most of his animation. Walt could use animation to create worlds, characters, and visions that transported viewers away from familiar visions that they could see in the world around them. Or Walt could use animation to create visions that, with touches of fantasy, resembled the world around us. For the most part, Disney animation took that second path. Many of the tools that the Disney studio developed were arranged so that animation aligned more closely with the values of a live-action feature. The multiplane camera, for example, was developed specifically so that animation could present a similar sense of depth that was found in live-action features. Likewise, those art training classes at the studio weren't arranged so that animators' drawings became more unique and expressive. They were arranged so that drawings better represented the realistic forms of people and animals. In those classes, instructors brought in models. At times, the models were people, and at times, the models were animals, such as young deer for Bambi, so that characters in animated sequences took on the physical complexities of their real-life counterparts. Even color was used, particularly in the features, not to create a vision that only existed on the screen, but primarily to replicate the tonal complexities one sees in the world around us. Together, I'd call this look of Disney animation a type of illustrated realism. The animation overall sought to represent the world around us with the inclusion of some fantasy elements. In terms of the artistic development of the Disney studio, Fantasia is the most significant departure from this early move toward realism in the Disney features. I might also add in a few sections from The Three Caballeros and Saludos Amigos when the animation takes on elements of surrealism, The Three Caballeros certainly have sections that slant towards illustrated realism, such as the Bahia segment, but there are other sections that have flourishes of surrealism in this film, such as the Os Quintindiayas segment, in which animated characters enter a Brazilian dance with human actors, only to have the streets and buildings around them shake and bend to the music, and then finally to have the entire diorama fold up like a child's pop-up illustration into the pages of a book. But the most significant departure from this move toward illustrated realism is in Fantasia. In terms of visual symbols, the symbol inside the film for what Fantasia hopes to achieve is this: the moment after The Sorcerer's Apprentice, when Mickey Mouse, an animated character dressed in medieval fantasy garb, walks up the podium to shake the hand of conductor Leopold Stokowski, a real person dressed in a tuxedo with tails. Presented in silhouette, this is the meeting of commercial animation, as represented by the mouse, with the world of high art as represented by Stokowski. This is also the path that Walt generally did not take with animation, the one that would have moved his studio away from realism and the visual tropes of live-action production. But in Fantasia, or at least some sections of Fantasia, this world is pretty much in full display. A couple of sections are deeply arranged as familiar fantasy worlds. One is arranged as a geographic history of the formation of the universe and of the Earth. Another is a religious myth about the battle between good and evil. The opening sequence, though, Toccata and Fugue in D minor, offers abstract representation of sound with nothing more than colorful lines and shapes, forms swirling together, lines of ribbon unfurled across blackness, hills undulating with color, an entire scene comprised of red and black bands like oceanic waves on an imaginary planet rolling ashore. All of this is arranged as montage, a series of images that aren't connected with a traditional story. This is the world of high art, in which shapes, colors, and with animation movement seek to impart their emotional textures to an audience through film. Even in early story meetings, Walt was deeply aware of how he was using images on screen and how these images were in dialogue with modern art. The initial idea was that these abstract images in the Toccata and Fugue section would be based on the visual waveforms of an analog soundtrack. This is Walt in a story meeting in November 1938 discussing how the world of music would give rise to this new type of abstract animation. Quote, when you get into some of those advanced forms, why not just keep them in the form of the soundtracks too? Build the various forms and shapes out of your soundtrack. This would give it a reason for existing if the design is all derived from the soundtrack. Just animate the pattern that the mechanical soundtrack suggests. And then, a little bit later, Walt expressed very clearly his understanding of the Disney aesthetic, that images on the screen had to have a reason to exist, which in the past meant that they were related to character development or story. In moving into experimental animation of color and shapes, he believed that abstract images might have a reason to exist if they were a visual interpretation of a sound wave. Quote, we have never dealt in the abstract. We have given things a reason for existing and tried to convince the audience that it could happen or was possible. I think even in this, if we take the soundtrack and use that and build through on that, it furnishes a reason for what we are doing on the screen. Walt also understood his audience, those people most likely to see a Disney film. Though they might be open to experiencing abstract art, their appreciation for non-narrative, non-representational art would have limits. Again, Walt was trying to work through this issue in that story meeting. Quote, too much of this abstract design will tire the audience. We don't want to do that. why not deal with it in another way at the beginning, such as using the shadows of our orchestra? It's really the first time you have seen the shadows of the orchestra. Let the lighting effect and color change as the music changes. We will have a certain color identified with the violins. When the deep notes come in, the color runs in and changes it completely. As those notes fade out, the color recedes and we come back to our original pure color. At first, it will be all dark. Then the light comes up and highlights Stokowski's features. As the orchestra starts, the color surges in. Stokowski becomes more of a silhouette, but still with the reflection from the color highlighting his face. With this, in a single meeting, Walt outlined the visual form of the first segment of Fantasia. Images of the orchestra largely presented in silhouette, the use of colored lights to create shadows, and then in animation, an abstract presentation of the waveform of the song itself. 2 years later, when the film was released, this is exactly what the audience saw on screen. Dim lights that present Stokowski so that his facial features are visible, but then those overhead spots dim, replaced by colored lights on a screen that presents him as a silhouette. In a similar fashion, the orchestra appears backlit or underlit with colored lights as silhouettes and shadows. As the music shifts from the toccata section into the fugue, the image of the orchestra fades into animation, where lines, dots, waves, patterns arranged by violin bows and strings imitate the visual waveform of the soundtrack until that waveform pattern opens to pure abstraction with shapes and colors keyed to the music. This section finishes with cloud, light, and water pattern effects fading back to Stokowski, conducting as silhouette before a blood-red screen. That is the opening number in Fantasia, which clearly communicates that in terms of animation, this film is in a different category of experience compared to things that came before it, Snow White, Pinocchio, and the Mickey Mouse shorts. If you've never seen Fantasia, or if you haven't seen it in a while, pull it up on Disney Plus and watch the Toccata and Fugue segment, which is the first 13 minutes of the film. The most famous section in Fantasia is The Sorcerer's Apprentice, which has been immortalized with Fantasmic. But in terms of an exploration of animation, Toccata and Fugue is a far more interesting example and has been viewed by a far smaller contemporary audience than the popular excerpts, which are The Sorcerer's Apprentice, The Rite of Spring with the Dinosaurs, and Night on Bald Mountain, with the horned beast rising up from the rockwork in the middle of the night. From segment to segment, Fantasia is a wide-open canvas, far more of a visual experience than a story. Fantasia was able to absorb visual impulses from the artistic traditions of abstraction, modernism, and surrealism, while still having one section that functioned as a traditional cartoon, although one with extremely high visual standards, and another section where the animals on screen were as lifelike and as anatomically researched as anything in Bambi. And so, in those months leading up to this film's release, as Walt held meetings with members of his story department for new segments, the possibilities were as wide open as anything ever explored at the Disney studio. These ideas were collected up in memos and story meeting notes. One person at these meetings, Bob Carr, explained that many of these ideas came from Walt himself, though now, 80 years later, it's nearly impossible to tell which ideas in this storm of creativity initiated with Walt. In all, the team developed treatments for 29 additional segments, along with over 60 more that were strongly considered but eventually dropped from consideration. Here are some highlights from those ideas that were considered decades ago. Some of the treatments for these proposed segments were fairly straightforward and even offered multiple narratives that might be used to visualize the music. Among these reasonably simple adaptations was Minuet in G by Beethoven. There were two concepts for Minuet in G. The first idea, with little imagination, involved a dance arranged with realistically drawn insects. Caterpillars who dance, then spin their cocoons, then emerge as butterflies to continue the dance in a field of flowers. But the second idea for the minuet, far more intriguing, was to use the song as the basis for a comedy sequence in an 18th century ballroom. Around the room would be mechanical clocks far more elaborate than any that could be produced in an actual workshop, and their unusual movements would be timed to the dance that played out on the floor. The dancers in the room itself would be significant figures in American and European history, such as Beethoven and Napoleon, whose gestures and actions could be tied to their achievements and personalities. One of the expected joys for this sequence was when the audience slowly recognized the identity of each figure. One of the concerns was that a significant part of the audience might not know who some of these figures, such as Napoleon, were. Other concepts were developed through a slightly stronger theoretical lens. This was the case with Perpetual Motion, or Moto Perpetuo by Paganini. This symphony featured a solo violin performing an endless string of notes delivered in rapid succession, a velocity of sound that sprinted up and down octaves, rarely slowing except to emphasize a transition. For Disney, this symphony was a hymn to automation, the music of the factory, and the age of home appliances. The visuals would focus on a fantastic animated machine with gears, bolts, and levers that at times arranged its metal into something that resembled faces. But the components of the machine each had their own personality. One group of levers were engaged in a battle for dominance with another group of levers. A slow, confused piston tried to escape the work of the grand machine, only to be pulled back into place by a valve. It was clear that this machine was making something, another metal object. But as the metal was moving quickly through the machine, with its pockets and caverns, it was impossible for the audience to tell exactly what product this machine was making. Like the violin, the work of the machine was fast and endless, never allowing for breaks, with various buttons, levers, and gears growing frustrated by the demands of automation. As the music moved toward its climax, the machine began to fall apart in an explosion of frenzied action, with bolts and gears flying up into the air, and that lone rebellious piston finally making his escape just before the machine crumbles to the ground in a pile of disconnected parts. And among all that rubble, finally emerges the product that the machine was making. It has produced, surprisingly, a smaller version of itself, ready to engage another round of work as soon as someone turns it on, presumably with music. This segment would no doubt be played for comedy, with many of the components having their own personalities. But beneath this was a social critique of modern labor. Work in a factory simply produced more work. Machines never went away. They simply became smaller. Modern work was often repetitive, rarely creative. And if you wanted to escape the system, there were forces in place, likely economic forces in the real world, to pull you back into the system, so that it was nearly impossible to leave the endless work that was laid out before you. And beyond Perpetual Motion, there were a number of pieces that tried to expand animation in interesting ways. Next up, in terms of theoretical complexity, is Adventures in a Perambulator by John Alden Carpenter. The premise here was straightforward: to convert the conceit of the symphony into a narrative. The entire segment would be presented from the perspective of a baby as a nurse wheels his carriage to the park and back. Artist Sylvia Holland created a series of concept drawings that illustrated how this sequence, if produced, might work. In her drawings, everything was presented from the perspective of the baby, lying on his back inside of a carriage. The baby would look up and see a hand on the stroller guiding it outside. The roof of the house would become the blue expanse of the sky. Then he would see a dragonfly, then balloons high above him, presumably as they were at the park, then branches of a flowering cherry tree, then birds. And then, as he fell asleep, all of these elements from the real world would combine into a dream sequence where flowers dance. The baby would wake up to find the nurse talking to a pleasant police officer who patrolled the park, though not in Holland's drawings. Story notes suggest that other scenes would include dogs that the baby watches play by the lake and a musician who plays the hurdy-gurdy, that is a stringed instrument from which sound is produced by turning a handle. The interesting element of this concept is not so much the visuals, but the conceit of the narrative. There is little, if any, story, especially in terms of rising tension and a climax. Instead of presenting a narrative focused on tension, the film asks us to experience the world from a perspective far from our own, even if that experience is little more than a typical day. Just as artists moved visuals further from realism during the first half of the 20th century, novelists, or at least some novelists, such as William Faulkner and James Joyce, moved fiction away from traditional stories and more into the subjective perceptions experienced by that character. Faulkner's best works, at least in my opinion, aren't an expression of grand narratives as much as they are an arrangement of language through which the reader is invited, or perhaps forced, to understand the psychological perceptions of a unique character. Language is arranged so that, moment by moment, we move forward joined with the thoughts and perceptions of the protagonist. In the 1920s and 1930s, some literary writers believed that the novel was the ideal form through which to explore how new concepts of psychology, developed by Freud and others, shaped the worldview and value centers of individual characters. This was achieved, in part, by pairing a reader with one character for long stretches of a novel, if not the entire novel, while using language that imitated the thought processes of that character. For these writers, a traditional story was not the center point of a novel. Rather, it was a nuanced description of a character rendered with psychological depth. In high school, these works are often called stream of consciousness novels. What's interesting here is that in this proposed segment, animators were attempting to do just that, but with visuals. There's no real story to speak of. But the visual presentation invites viewers to experience the world through the eyes of the baby for the entire segment, with his psychology expressed not only by what he chooses to focus on, but more significantly, how those elements of experience are arranged while he sleeps into dreams. Some of the story notes even explore how the animation, such as through a tilted layout, might better represent the point of view of the infant. Also, these notes suggest that, as infants might perceive colors as softer than do adults, some images in the film might be gently blurred or lightened to deepen the visual point of view of the baby. On the surface, this segment looks simple, the whimsical experience of a baby without a deep story and without a large reliance on comedy. But beneath it are some stronger engines that are asking interesting questions, such as how might animation, with music, pick up some of the narrative strategies that have been explored in modernist novels? Specifically, how might animation allow an audience for 15 or 20 minutes to be carried back to a world before words, before complex tastes, and before nuanced thoughts? In short, how might animation, through a deep sense of point of view, allow an audience to be carried back to the experience of being a baby? Again, moving up the scale of complexity and ambition by another step, we arrive at a lengthy segment based on the New World Symphony by Dvorak and traditional spirituals arranged for a symphony orchestra. For New World Symphony, which was composed back in the 1890s, Dvorak was deeply influenced by Native American music and African American spirituals. About these musical traditions, Dvorak said, quote, "These can be the foundation of a serious and original school of composition to be developed in the United States. These beautiful and varied themes are the product of the soil." The plan at the Disney studio, based on the notes that exist, was to use sections of Dvorak's New World Symphony combined with African American spirituals to create an extended segment for a new Fantasia project. For this 30 to 40-minute segment, Disney would arrange an all African American voice cast, including, ideally, Marian Anderson, Paul Robeson, and the Hall Johnson Chorus. Marian Anderson and Paul Robeson were significant African-American artists in the 1930s and 1940s. Anderson was a contralto who had toured Europe and had faced significant racism in America. In 1939, she was denied multiple venues in which to perform in Washington, D.C., which still had segregation laws covering public schools and recreation centers. With the support of the president and his wife, she was invited to sing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial on Easter Sunday before a live audience of 75,000 people and a national radio audience of millions. Paul Robeson, a singer and actor, was also focused on political ideals. In performances of Old Man River from Showboat, he rewrote the lyrics himself so that the song in its final moments focused on the necessary fight toward equality. He also took the fight for equality into his personal life. In Los Angeles in the 1930s and 1940s, individual businesses could, and many did, discriminate based on race. African Americans traveling by car often used a guide called the Motorist Green Book, which indicated which hotels, restaurants, bars, and salons did not discriminate based on race. In Los Angeles, there were over 200 such businesses that were open to all people, but there were also hundreds that weren't. When staying at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel in Los Angeles, which tended to discriminate against less famous African Americans, Robeson spent 2 hours each afternoon sitting in the lobby talking to people who walked by so that other African Americans would feel more comfortable next time they stayed there. The effect of this was a lessening of discriminatory policies in Los Angeles area hotels. By the time he was 35 and a film star, he chose his roles carefully to promote ideals that he believed were important to people of African descent living in countries around the world. He rather famously said he could not be a performer divorced from the political realities around him. Quote, "The artist must take sides," he said. In this, the Disney team was reaching not simply for performers who were African American, but to individuals whose artistic and personal lives aligned them with the political struggle for equality. This segment, if produced, would have been a first for a major studio to create animation focused with an all-African American cast and focused on African American culture. And in terms of the history of animation, I don't believe that there was a major piece of animation produced with an all-African American voice cast until the 1970s. But here this idea is in 1940. I should also put this up front. It's clear from the notes that there is an earnest attempt to use animation to represent cultural experience outside of that of white Americans or Europeans, but at times the people in these meetings struggled to effectively imagine a cultural perspective outside of their own, and also move beyond a European-centered approach to history. I don't mean to minimize that. There are clear missteps here. But the impulse in these meetings is to find a way for animation to move beyond the European center that had underpinned much of Disney's output for years, even if there are significant lapses in the process of imagining how animation might communicate these elements. Among the voices who are most insistent that this is a worthy project is Walt, especially as he insisted that more time be given to this segment than any other segment presently in Fantasia. In working through these issues, the Disney team does arrive at some interesting moments. They contemplate how religious figures, such as an angel, might be presented as having no specific color or race on screen. They suggest using, as one element, a spiritual in which the biblical figure of Moses confronts Pharaoh in Egypt, which would create an opportunity to arrange mini scenes in Egypt, which would have been the first Disney animation to represent a historically realistic version of Northeast Africa, with animated figures representing African experience on screen. Again, there's some missteps in the development, some that would be embarrassing today. 2022 is a different world of cultural sensitivity compared to 1940. But in these materials, there's also some compelling moments in which the story team acknowledges that the Disney vision has been the product of a European imagination and that a new approach to visual development will be needed so that animation represents the experience of African Americans with the same level of authenticity. Presumably, this project would have more depth once individuals like Marian Anderson and Paul Robeson offered input. But this was not the only proposed project that would explore culture through animation. Another project, though less developed, would take place almost wholly on a Chinese tapestry. The sequence would open in an antique shop, perhaps in San Francisco, where the camera would focus in on a silk tapestry that would then come to life, presenting a story through figures and masks and animals, intricate images made of thread that would move with music. Both of these projects sound far more like films that were produced in the 1990s, rather than animation that was considered in 1940. But this idea, how can film explore a range of cultures, was an idea that Walt, once he had established a successful studio, considered for the rest of his life. He would create documentary films about cultural experience and would propose park areas, though most of these park areas were not built in his lifetime, to explore world cultures as well. To put the efforts for these proposed Fantasia segments in a historical perspective, while some American cities and some American businesses still worked under a system of racial segregation laws and policies, questions about how culture could be explored through animation were being considered at the Disney studio, which is an indicator as to where the studio was in terms of cultural openness decades before these concepts were realized in Hollywood. The Disney studio today, with its many cultural explorations, is not so much a reaction to recent changes in culture as it is an extension of projects that Walt considered and later developed going back to the 1940s and 1950s. None of these segments were, of course, produced. They were proposed largely in 1940 before Fantasia was released. By the time Fantasia reached theaters, the war in Europe was expanding and limiting Disney's abilities to sell tickets overseas. Also, Fantasia in the US, despite its ambition, wasn't as successful as Walt had hoped. Fantasia was released a couple of months after America began its first peacetime draft to prepare for the possible participation in the war. Though America wasn't yet involved in the war with a draft, everyone could see that the country was likely headed in that direction. The mood of the country at that time wasn't ideal for a film that fused high art with animation. And with these financial realities also went Disney's hope of producing a series of new segments. But so far, we haven't talked about Cosmic Rewind and its connection to these proposed segments for a revised Fantasia. So let's close with this. There were a number of story concepts for these proposed segments that included key Disney characters, something that would follow the pattern of The Sorcerer's Apprentice. In one, Mickey and Minnie invite an audience into the theater while the overture to The Marriage of Figaro plays. In another, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs were considered for a comic revamping of A Midsummer Night's Dream. Beyond this, the dwarfs Dopey and Grumpy were also considered for roles in The Legend of Siegfried, a dramatic fantasy with wizards and dragons that was tied to the Ring Cycle by Wagner. But the most deeply imagined segment at this point for the Disney characters was arranged around the orchestral suite The Planets by Gustav Holst. And this is where there are some interesting overlaps between that recently opened coaster over at EPCOT, Cosmic Rewind, which we talked about a couple of weeks ago. As you hopefully recall, we discussed how one key scene from the Universe of Energy was based on animation from the Rite of Spring section of Fantasia, the battle between the T-Rex and the Stegosaurus. Cosmic Rewind is the attraction that takes over the space once used by the Universe of Energy. And there's a strange coincidence in that one of the unproduced sections for later Fantasia segments matches up rather nicely with Cosmic Rewind. Again, we talked about some of these things a couple of weeks ago. The conceptual development for Cosmic Rewind moved the project from a coaster focused on science to a coaster focused on science with the addition of intellectual property, specifically Marvel characters from the Guardians of the Galaxy. The original concept for this coaster was more or less an updating of Space Mountain, in which a roller coaster train would explore the Big Bang and then move through the galaxy, an idea that fit fairly well into the old Future World section of EPCOT. But then there was a corporate request to include in this project a handful of Marvel characters. And this same progression framed a development for one of those never-produced sections of Fantasia as well. The conceit behind Holst's 1919 orchestral suite was to shade each of the known planets with a musical theme to allow the audience to contemplate the environment there. The music for Mars, the planet named after the god of war, held elements of a military march layered with harsh sounds and dissonance, suggesting the difficulties of life there, while the section for Venus was softer and more harmonious. Jupiter was presented with sweeping grandness. The music lent itself to a consideration of the terrain of other planets that for Disney could be used to explore those places with imaginative wonder. But just as with Cosmic Rewind, the Disney impulse back in the 1940s was to add intellectual property to make the material more entertaining, namely Mickey, Donald, and Pluto, who would board a spacecraft visually developed with a high degree of engineering accuracy as something that might actually lift up into space. Their adventures would then take them to multiple planets, where the tones of Holst's suite would inspire drama on screen. On Mars, they would be met by warlike creatures made of metal. On Venus, they would find a colony of beautiful women who enthrone Mickey and Donald as the rulers of love. On Mercury, they would find a technologically advanced civilization who focus their entire lives on work to maintain their endless machines. On Saturn, they would find a culture where every living creature is exceptionally old, with Mickey showing them how to act young again, and so on as they move with music through the solar system until they return to Earth. But in this, there was also the framework for how the Disney company was working then. Could a Fantasia segment simply explore those planets without Mickey and Donald? Absolutely. But there was an impulse, even back in 1940, at times, to include characters as a way of making a film more enjoyable. So if you prefer EPCOT without characters, and the truth is, I think I would, And if you think that Cosmic Rewind might be more successful as an experience that explores the Big Bang and the solar system without the addition of the Marvel characters, and again, the truth is, I think I might as well, just know that this general impulse to add characters into material that explores scientific wonders is not anything new in the history of the Disney studio. It's not something that Chapek started nor that Iger started, though they both increased levels of IP at EPCOT. This specific strategy is something that can be traced back many decades to the time of Walt. In Fantasia, released in 1940, the section of animation that explored the formation of the galaxy and of Earth, the section called The Rite of Spring, presented animation grounded in a scientific understanding of the formation of Earth and the evolution of life without any characters. But in a proposed update to Fantasia, a new section that, if produced, would have explored the solar system wasn't simply focused on a scientific understanding and the engineering realities of the 1940s. It was arranged as an adventure for Mickey, Donald, and Pluto as they moved from planet to planet, somewhat like the Guardians and Eson on Cosmic Rewind, as guests rocket through the cosmos in a space where once stood the far more science-focused universe of energy. I'll be back next week with a new episode. And for those of you who would like to explore more of Walt's efforts to create documentaries and develop spaces in Disneyland that explored international culture, you'll find an album of 3 episodes over on Bandcamp called Walt and Internationalism, which was posted a couple of years ago. This 3-part series runs about 2 hours and explores these concepts in depth. As you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. Without subscribers, we would simply cease to exist. We do just 2 things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Walt Disney Company. If you enjoy these episodes, please support our efforts by becoming a monthly Bandcamp subscriber. On Bandcamp, you'll find dozens and dozens of extra episodes, including that album about Walt and internationalism. But the best reason to subscribe is to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can subscribe at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in the show notes. Until next Sunday, this is Todd James Pierce.